Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this talk being given by John Brender. So I'll start with an introduction, introducing Dr. Brender, and then we will move forward into his talk. So John Brender works with the Office of International Programs at Wayne State University, where he currently oversees the newly emerging Center for Student Global Engagement and teaches a course for the English Language Institute. He has taught Spanish, Japanese, linguistics, foreign language teaching methods, and English as a second language. His research focuses on international and ethnic student identity and values at North American universities and on North American experiences abroad. In 2008, he published Japanese College Students in the U.S., Identity and Values, and most recently, a book entitled Millennial Expats in China, Experiences and Observations. He has also published papers on second-generation Chaldean and Asian Indian college students, focusing on perceptions of bicultural and multicultural identity. Between 2008 and 2021, Dr. Brender served as director of the Confucius Institute at Wayne State University, and was granted a Personal Excellence Award in 2015 in Shanghai by former Vice Premier Madame Yang Dong-Lu and the Office of Chinese Language International. While director at the Wayne State Confucius Institute, Dr. Brender wrote and produced several short documentaries and 168 short videos highlighting Chinese idioms for second language learners of Mandarin. He holds a PhD in higher adult and lifelong education from Michigan State University, an MA in Community College Administration from Chicago State University, an MA in Romance Linguistics from the University of Michigan, and a BA in Spanish from Hope College. And today he will be speaking to us on the subject of millennial expats in China, experiences and observations. So thank you so much, Dr. Brender. We look forward to hearing this talk.
All right, thank you. First of all, does everybody hear me okay? Yes, can I get a yes? No? Hello?
Yes, you can get a yes. We can hear
you. All right,
you.
very good. Just wanted to make sure. All right. I'll be talking today about Millennial Expats in China, a book that I wrote during the pandemic. And as I was sitting on a lot of information, I thought, well, why not share some of the things that I've learned and maybe enhance some of the things that I had known previously. So let me first ask the obvious question: why did I write this book? Well, it was to convey adjustment to another culture, and I think what works in China may apply to adjusting elsewhere. To convey life for internationals in China. What is it like to live in China? And basic knowledge and truths about China. And I emphasize truths because I think we're not always getting a lot of truthful reporting on some of our television networks and some periodicals and so on and so forth. So I wanted to just sort of set the record straight to some degree. And who did I write this for? This was for, of course, future sojourners, people planning to go to China. Their concerned family members, which I think is a big thing. We don't just go to China when we're 19 or 20 without our parents worrying a little bit about us. And generally for people who are curious about China. Why millennials? Okay, well, I have to be completely honest and say I did this out of convenience because most of the people that I worked with fit very nicely within that born in 1980 through 1995 window. But also for future researchers. I'm not out to make any comments or generalizations about millennials, but in the future, if somebody looks at Gen Z going to China, they may be able to see some worthwhile differences. Okay, my book is divided into two parts. First, the personal experiences, and second of all, perceptions of Chinese institutions. But today I'm just going to talk about some personal experiences. I normally just cover one or two chapters, so I've abbreviated a few. So hopefully we'll get all this in and it will make some sense to you. All right, let's look first of all at the demographics of the participants in this study. I worked with 20 different people, and I felt I had a pretty good array of participants. So if we look first of all by age, you'll notice that millennials by April 1st, 2020 ranged in age between 25 and basically 40 or 41. And so you'll see a fairly good distribution by age. Also by race, you'll see of the 20 people that I interviewed, 12 were white, 2 identified as Latino, 5 as Black, not just necessarily African-American, since I spoke with someone from the Caribbean, and also Asian, 1 Asian, okay? Other demographics by gender, 14 men to 6 women. This probably reflects the ratio of Americans going to China. I was looking for some sort of official numbers, which I could not find, but most people I interviewed said you're generally going to find at least twice as many men as women in China, okay? I mean, I should say American men as women in China, not Chinese people. By major, far and away, people were studying in the humanities, social studies, and Asian studies area. Not a lot of science majors tended to go to China. It's just the way things seem to work out, and I'll explain that in a later chapter. Years in China, if we look at the amount of time that people had spent in China as of my interview date, 6 were there for under 2 years, generally at least 18 months. 10 of them had been there for between 4 and 6 years, and 4 of them had been there between 7 and 11 years. So everyone was pretty seasoned, I would say. And when I asked people to provide a self-report on their ability to speak Chinese, I got this distribution. I personally did not always agree with it, but let's say that most people felt that they could get along pretty well in Chinese, but realized, of course, there's always room for improvement. Okay. I thought this was an interesting demographic because I felt that I had talked with people with very different personalities, and it's kind of after the fact, I asked people to rate themselves on an introvert extrovert scale from 1 to 10, and this is a distribution that I got, and I felt it was pretty reflective of the people that I spoke with. So again, in conclusion, we have a pretty wide variety of people by gender, by race, by whether they're introverted, extroverted, how serious they were about studying Chinese, and so on. So hopefully some of the information I have will be worthwhile as opposed to purely skewed. Okay, for the nerds out there, I used a grounded theory. I tried not to be prejudiced by any given lens, so I asked very open-ended questions. I tried not to lead or be leading at any point, and so I transcribed the interviews. They were all between 1 and 2 hours generally, and then I coded them, and then I started looking for similarities, differences, patterns, and so on and so forth. Okay. These are the chapters that I'm going to cover. Notice the impressionistic painting I have here. So we'll talk about prior impressions, first impressions, changing impressions, and then personal changes, and a little bit about how expats look at other expats. All right, prior impressions fell into 3 categories. They were 1, informed but skewed ideas, 2, totally misguided ideas, and 3, absolutely no idea at all. So one quote that I had from there was a skewed impression on both sides said, I had, on the one hand, all the people in my immediate family and community telling me like, oh, this is a third world, unsafe, strange place. And then I also had people in my school community telling me that, oh no, this is an exciting, fun place with a lot going for it. So I think the combination of those 2 things going was my impression. Those 2 things was my impression going. I do need to say that China is very safe. So anyone who's talking about it being dangerous, I think you have a far greater chance of, getting mugged or whatever in this country than you will in China. I've never, ever in the least felt slightly unsafe there. But this is just an idea of some of the skewed ideas that people had going in. Another student said, I probably watched a lot of Kung Fu movies, a lot of, say, travel channels. So I was thinking, okay, I'm going to see rickshaws, I'm going to see the guzhongs and everywhere, and it'll be like old style China. So I can guarantee you're not going to have a lot of Bruce Lee's accost you in the street. You're not going to see a lot of old time rickshaws. You'll probably hear a lot more guzhong than you want in the hotels, but aside from that, it's not going to be guzhongs everywhere. Okay. Another misguided idea is that it is like North Korea. Some older Chinese that I speak to will tell me, well, China in the 50s and 60s was maybe quite a bit like North Korea is now, but China is far more open. I don't want to say completely open, but obviously people are coming in and out of China. There is a flow of ideas. People are exposed to the outside world. It's not like North Korea in any respect at this point. Another misconception is that it's like Japan, okay? And having lived in Japan for 2.5 years and made 24 trips to China, I will tell you that it is about 179 degrees different. And the main thing, if I had to sum it up and people say, how is China different from Japan? I would point to one of Hofstede's values, which is uncertainty avoidance. And what do I mean by that? In Japan, there are elaborate sets of rules for just about everything, and often to avoid uncertainty. So when there is an uncertain situation, some of the Japanese can fret a bit, okay? So there are rules for how far to bow. There are tons of footwear rules, when to put on slippers, when to take them off, where to leave your shoes, business card etiquette, how to hold your chopsticks. Everything I did in Japan for 2 years was wrong. And the only face that I saw was one of horror for 2 years. China, I would say, in contrast, is much more forgiving. They have a term, meiguanxi, it's okay, it doesn't matter, or as the Australians would translate it, no worries, mate, okay? And then third, absolutely no idea at all. So a lot of people were attracted to going to a place that they knew nothing about, and they would just unpack things as they got there. So one student said, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't do any research. I wanted like a big surprise, okay? So there's the excitement of taking the plunge, and having traveled to Japan to live for the first time when I was 22, I would say that I was by no means a Japanophile, and I was just very excited for the experience. All right, what are the first impressions? The first impressions are generally pretty surface, as you might expect, okay? So in general, when I fleshed out all of the answers, there was crowds and perceived chaos, convenient transportation, differences in sanitation, and some felt welcomed and some less welcome, okay? So just very quickly, I'll mention some of these surface first impressions. Crowds, we can understand. China has 1.4 billion people. The top two, I would say, are very exaggerated. Having lived in Japan and Yokohama, I will tell you, and spent a lot of time in Tokyo, it's much more crowded there. It's much more crowded in a lot of places than it is in China. So I personally don't feel it's extremely dense, but for someone coming from Michigan, going to China for the first time, sure, crowds. They have a term, "人山人海," which is people mountain, people sea, people everywhere, okay? Another thing that a lot of people mentioned was chaos and flow, like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Everybody is going in every different direction. I can't understand the bureaucratic systems, so on and so forth. So one of the respondents I had did a master's degree in Chinese philosophy, and I thought she had a very insightful passage to share, which is, I think nowadays most Chinese view chaos as we do in the West, bad, wild, unorganized. But instead of wanting or demanding structure, they see chaos in these instances as unchanging or just the way it is, because it's the 没办法 lifestyle. So Chinese don't act out against it. They accept it, right? So it's the idea of accepting flow. You see flow and you just work with it. Convenient transportation. A lot of Americans especially are really excited by the transportation. If you want to go from Wuhan to Beijing, you probably have at least 24 flights a day that you can choose from. It's absolutely amazing. The high-speed railways, the buses, the subways, the taxis, even getting around campus on a tuk-tuk now and then. So transportation in China is absolutely amazing. Sanitation was another thing that people noticed. We've all heard a bit about the air pollution. Sometimes you'll see a bit of litter. The bathrooms are not always perfectly well kept. But I have a quote from a boomer who said, this is a professor, who's been working with Chinese for quite a while. And she said, my first trip was 1978, and the skies were blue through the 1980s, as I remember. Of course, it was truly a developing country back then, so things were simpler, and there weren't so many sanitation systems in place then. Plus, the population, while large, wasn't so huge as now, 40 years later. High rises were very few and far between, as were cars and stores and consumerism. So again, there was less waste being produced. So it's a mixed comparison, okay? So I found a little picture of the blue skies from 1980. Another student, an athlete from Minnesota, I thought had an interesting insight, and he was very positive about how welcome he felt. And he said, just like amazing, such friendly people. Our language skills weren't that great at that time, but they'd still appreciate our efforts. And then when my language skills grew, I could really connect with people. So I appreciate those times, like taxi drivers or all those small conversations where I just really got to understand deeply China. But at first, it was very surface level. But yeah, just the genuine heart of the Chinese people is really what was communicated. And I have to put in a plug for Chinese taxi drivers next to teachers of the Chinese language. They are great at understanding however poor your Chinese is, and they will communicate with you. So they're great to have conversations with. Next. These are changing impressions. And when I really stop to think about changing impressions, it really has a lot to do with the person as well as the environment, because both change at the same time. And so a quote by Heraclitus came to mind, which is, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, right? So we developed, everything around us develops. So when we talk about changing impressions, we have to realize that everything changes, right? So I'm going to start with a few personal changes, what happened to individuals, as much as we can separate that. Of course, there's culture shock, okay? And whether it begins with euphoria and goes to shock or in some different order, I don't necessarily attest. But what I will say is that over time, getting used to foreign values goes from love and hate to like and dislike, and appreciate not so much, and prefer and not prefer. And over time, you may not totally get used to something, but your love and hate amplitude tends to decrease over time. So as you get used to things, yeah, that's just the way it is. Okay. Here's a quote about culture shock from one of my participants. So I think initially there was the shock, right? And that was the biggest thing. And it was hard to get anywhere beyond that in the beginning. Then after a while, you start to get used to it, right? So you stop noticing the environmental things and you start to pay attention to just what's going on. And I think it did change in some respects. For the first couple of years, I just focused on myself and on my studies, right? And so I think it was fun. I enjoyed it, okay? So I think when he was able to go from looking at everything around him and get used to that and focus on himself, things just sort of got a little easier. Another thing, I thought this was an interesting quote, understanding bureaucracy. One of the participants said, the feeling of chaos and inorganization and the bureaucracy kind of stuff of China, that was a constant throughout, up until now, in fact. But yeah, I felt close to the country and the people there at the end of my time there. So I thought it was interesting that he might criticize something of Chinese culture, but on the other hand, he began to own it and appreciate it as, this is my own. It might be a little dysfunctional, but it's like my family. It's like my city. It's something that I can completely accept. Another student who had studied law said about the government, I developed some empathy and understanding for the Chinese government, having studied law there. I learned how the system is supposed to work, talked to many Chinese and understood a little better how it actually works. And somewhere in between the two, I just gained a great understanding for their way of doing things. And it was a little intimidating because there's so much negativity in our media surrounding their government. Okay, if you want to see the insight, read my book. And then another thing was personal changes was understanding character and moods. And one of my respondents said, people were always yelling. And I was like, are they angry? And I remember I spoke to a Chinese friend. She was teaching me Chinese, and she said, no, actually, just maybe there's too many people. So we have to speak up. And so I used to think people were always angry, but I think it has to also do with the heat in Wuhan. In the summertime, too, it gets so hot. And maybe people are just a little bit angry, but not like really angry, you know? They're just having a long day, a hot day. Okay. And this one came from someone who's been there for more than 10 years and living in Wuhan and kind of feeling, you know, there's the difference between who I am and being Chinese. And he says, I've always been of the opinion that this culture was very welcoming to all kinds of other foreigners. And that's still mostly true of the people. But one thing that always sticks in the back of my mind is that no matter how long I spend here or how involved in this society I become, I will never be Chinese. And they do have a very distinct line between Chinese and foreigners living here. So it's a little unsettling. When I first came here, I was like, oh yeah, this is awesome. And it was nice meeting all the foreigners here, but it's definitely weighed on me a little bit that with the intention of building a life here, remaining here for a long period of time, you don't feel super secure, okay? And as a number of people may be aware, there are always, you know, little diplomatic wars where, you know, one consulate or one embassy raises a visa price, and so does another. And one starts to deny people coming into their country, and so does the other. So there's always that concern that a capricious officer at one of the consulates might just deny somebody with no questions asked. So yes, there is a little bit of an insecurity, I suppose, when you're trying to build a life in China, where incidentally, citizenship for foreigners is harder to get than apparently anywhere in the world. Okay, let's talk a little bit about changes in the environment, some of the changes people saw around them during the time that they were in China. And this is sort of on the cusp of being a personal change and an environmental change. But one student said, I suppose some of my positive feelings were numbed a little bit, you know, some of the mystery. For example, it's not all Taoism and kids with ponytails lighting off fireworks. It's the real world. It's gritty. There's a lot of struggle, and I realized these things. Another respondent noticed the infrastructure growing immensely from the time he'd arrived. I can tell you that my first time in Wuhan, from the airport to the university, I think we drove 45 minutes before I really saw anything. The next time I went, it was maybe 35 minutes, and then I started seeing high rises, and then it was 30 minutes and 25 and 20 and 15 until there were high-rise buildings that backed up all the way from the university to practically the airport. So when I talk about building, it is at a level that Americans cannot even fathom. But his response was, I was constantly amazed by the scale of the economic machine here. And I was of the opinion that this can't last. This is unsustainable. This has to cave at some point. And being here for this long, you see that it's not just an anomaly. It's a way of life that's been building for a long time. Regarding censorship and surveillance, something that has gotten a bit more strict over the years, one respondent said, trying to do research where information is much more tightly controlled, much more strictly controlled, at least what's put out officially and with what they let news outlets produce, was frustrating because my first impression was in academia, where we're all in this for the greater truth of learning. Okay. And regarding even censorship in classrooms, one respondent said, I never had anyone tell me what to say specifically, except for papers that I had written. They told me not to talk about certain things sensitive to China, but when I talked about certain issues in my class, we would have debates on certain issues, and I found that all of a sudden, students that I had never seen before were sitting in my class spouting the party line. I asked some of my closer students in the class, and they called them part-time spies. Okay, this is a picture of me at the Huazhong University of Science and Technology, and I can assure you this was not a part-time spy. These students were all very lovely. And then a change in people, okay? participant who'd been there 11 years said, well, my impression is that everyday Chinese people are still quite curious about the foreign world, but they were probably more so when I first arrived from like 2009 to 2012-ish. But I felt that there's been a bit of a change in recent years where I wouldn't say that I felt unwelcome or that people were unfriendly, but the atmosphere felt a little colder to me. Towards the end of my stay in China, I felt a sense of confidence among the Chinese people where their country's at, some changes in the government and things like that. So a little bit less open than before, I could say. All right, let's look at what I think is probably the most important thing as a result of living in China, and that is personal changes. All right, so what I came up with after my simple open-ended question of how have you changed being in China, came up with independence and responsibility, resilience, boldness coupled with patience, empathy, passive acceptance, changes in religious or worldview perspectives, okay? So I have a quote for each of these. So independence and responsibility, this is from a student from Michigan who spent time in Shanghai and again, studied Chinese philosophy in Chinese. And she said, it really forced me to become an adult in ways that I probably would have gotten to, just slower if I had never gone to China. But China really did jumpstart that because I had to learn the language. I had to learn the cultural ins and outs and also the subcultures. A very interesting article I came across in The Atlantic as I was writing this had to do with the anxious child and about overprotective parents who are shielding their children from anxiety-provoking situations. And I thought this was interesting. Essentially, children shielded from challenging situations were more likely to develop and suffer from anxiety later in life. As I mentioned, this is interesting, I think, because the people who went to China and really had to deal with anxiety-provoking situations, whether they were trying to get a bus ticket or talk to a cab driver or, you know, have something changed on their visa, it's very anxiety-provoking. And these are people who have to get up and do it again and again. And I think that the idea of living abroad, especially where you're forced to learn a new language and get along in that new language, really toughens you up in a lot of ways. A resilience quote, reminiscent of something Frank Sinatra sang, was, if I can survive here, I feel like I can kind of survive anywhere else. I can live on my own or navigate through life. And another interesting quote on resilience was, you learn a lot from the work ethic of the students in China and the teachers in China. They do work hard. They try hard. I've always been a little bit spoiled. You kind of see that people in the US are a little bit spoiled. And you can kind of push yourself to points maybe you wouldn't be able to get to before. So I think just reacting to people around you that are working so hard and trying so hard can very often take you to the next level as well. Another quote, this is from an American woman who married a Chinese gentleman who is from the countryside. They both currently live together in Wuhan. And she said about visiting her in-laws, in this countryside, everything they do it by hand. They made shoes by hand, and they were showing me this ladder that his grandpa made, and everything was by hand. And they have this little small yard, and they plant tomatoes, and they have this pear tree, and everyone's always going to visit them. And I can tell you, having spent some time in the countryside in China, there are people who are just amazing. I can remember trudging up a mountain about 12 years ago when I was in relatively good shape myself, and I had good climbing boots. And I saw a local villager who was probably about 5'6" and well into his 60s and smoking a cigarette and wearing flip-flops and carrying a small tree over his shoulder and just walking through the mountains like it was nothing. So, you know, you see some unbelievably resilient people, especially in the countryside. Boldness coupled with patience. This took me a little bit to figure out, and I had to discuss this with some of my participants long after the interviews or a bit after the interviews. But essentially, I think this quote says a lot. says, I think that I handle conflicts a lot better. I didn't like confrontation, and I didn't like to stand up for myself when I knew something was wrong. And that's happened several times. And so I've learned to really face things head on and learn when to jump in and when to fight for myself and not always jump the gun and straight away be angry about the situation. Okay. So you'll see, as I'll mention in a bit, a little bit of passive acceptance, but you also, when you realize if you don't have your visa updated within, the next 24 hours, you learn to be bold. You learn to stand up and get what you need to have done. Empathy was a big thing that people felt they learned. They were able to put themselves in the shoes of an outsider, sometimes for the first time. And one of the respondents said, before I went to China, even at the prep school and where I did my undergrad, both places had a pretty significant international student population. And I was friends with them, but never bridged the gap to really connect with them until I went to China and was a foreigner myself and had that real experience as the outsider. And so that was really pivotal and gave me more empathy or a softer heart when I came back to really relate with them. Okay, so I had a number of respondents who said, wow, now that I'm the foreigner, I understand what it's like to be somewhere else. And I can only imagine what it must be like to be, say, a refugee or that kind of a thing. Another empathy quote was, I'd never been to a place before China where I was the minority, where I was literally the only white person on the street, where everyone was staring at me, where I was the weird one, the outlier, expected to kind of represent something, which is cliche, but it's very true. And just being put in that position in such a drastic way, I feel I really opened my eyes to that. And then there was passive acceptance. And I love this quote. This is one of my favorites. From a gentleman from Detroit who is now living in Taiwan. And he says, for the first year or so, I was a dumb, arrogant American. Why doesn't China do it this way? But later I realized just because they do it differently doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's different. And I need to drink a nice tall glass of shut the hell up and just change how I react to the situation. And once I did that, things got a lot better. Dropping those expectations just made me realize, okay, this is fun. This is actually not a bad way to live. Okay, and this gentleman has been in China and Taiwan, I think, for a total of at least 10 years at this point. So, and then another person said, the casual air that everyone kind of accepts that, yes, you need a VPN to get accurate information. And if you don't want your information tracked, you probably shouldn't buy the SIM card from the official places. Just go to the vendors on the street that sell them for 15 kwai. The sort of passive acceptance that everyone had of that situation is what was a catalyst for me. So, it's the me banfa. What can I do about it? So I'm going to work with however I can. Worldview changes. Okay, this went in all directions. So if you feel like going to China is going to, somehow subvert your values or whatnot, I will tell you that people I talked to went in every imaginable direction. And by the way, that's me in the corner, losing my religion. So there was one respondent at least who said that once the tenets of his religion were challenged and he began to think differently, he more or less abandoned his religion. But on the other hand, another respondent said that his Christian faith had deepened as a result of being there, that he felt he turned more to prayer and more to people who he found who shared his faith. Another person actually became born again through some other people that she had met. One person really got into practicing Taoism and Tai Chi and just really enjoyed the whole philosophical part of it. And then there were those who were disappointed in a lack of Buddhism, that they were hoping to find something a little deeper, but that they didn't find quite what they had hoped for. The most common among my participants was just basically agnosticism. People who had a pretty open view and were willing to listen to things, but not necessarily commit. And one of the respondents said this: hardly anyone believes in Apollo and Poseidon, but we still read the Iliad because it's clear there is something worth learning. And so I saw every experience with religion in China through that lens. I was diligent in my study and translation of Confucius and Lao Tzu and all the old Chinese masters, and I took every opportunity to hear the spiritual beliefs of everyday Chinese that I spoke with. Not because I was searching for a conversion experience, but because I enjoy learning their stories and traditions and the little kernels of wisdom therein. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention is how foreigners began to stratify other foreigners. All right, so ways of classifying were by nationality, by field of study, by occupation, by age, and by motives for being there. So let's take a quick look at these and we'll conclude. So first of all, by nationality, in 2019, before the pandemic, there were approximately 1 million foreign residents in China. Half attended Chinese universities, generally because there are only work visas and study visas that people go on. 10% were from South Korea. That was by far the largest contingent. 20 to 30,000 each came from Thailand, Pakistan, India, the US, and Russia. Just under 15,000 came from Indonesia, Laos, and Japan. The Kazakhs numbered about 12,000. And small numbers from areas, from countries we don't very often see here in the US, such as North Korea, Syria, Mauritius, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Peru, Seychelles, etc. Okay. And by field of study, I think it's fairly accurate to say that for humanities and social studies, you will generally find people coming from North America and Europe, very often because we have very developed areas in medicine and the sciences. And so people who come to China are generally there to study something very related to China. On the other hand, in the STEM fields, you're more likely to find people from Asia and Africa, oftentimes because China does have some good programs in the STEM fields, and because, for example, their medical colleges are far more open to international students than American medical colleges. It's almost rare to bring someone from another country into an American medical school. Another thing is by occupation. So generally, if you were to stratify people by occupation, you're going to see a lot of students, a lot of teachers. Americans tended to be bar and restaurant owners, the ones who were entrepreneurial, because that was an area where they could succeed and do fairly well. Other professionals, you found occasionally, sometimes an engineer, computer programmer, but they were far fewer. And though it's not a profession, clubbers. He said there were a lot of people who are out all the time going to clubs. And I should say most people were a combination of these things, right? A lot of people came in as teachers, but they became bar and restaurant owners, but their work visas were for being teachers, sometimes for being students and so on. A lot of students were able to teach. It was very easy to find part-time jobs at the very least. And a lot of people were going to clubs. So there's a huge number of all of these inside of individuals, I should say. Next, someone who used the term party hat, I thought was interesting. And he said, by age, you have the people there, the foreigners who are 19 to 22, and they can party until the cows come home. They're there all the time. They can't get enough. Those who are a little older, maybe they're grad students, maybe they're starting to teach, they're a little bit less enthusiastic. The party hat is starting to fall off. And then those who are 27 to 29, especially the people who are starting to make a life in China, maybe starting a family, maybe an English language institute, they were going to the clubs a lot less frequently. They might still want that interaction, but they were starting to show a little, some signs of aging at that point. And by motives for being there, clearly a lot of people put themselves in this category, that they were there to learn. There are people who really out there to learn everything they can about China. Of course, there are people there for partying. They just enjoy the nightlife. Some find that the lifestyle is fairly easy. You can, for example, teach at a private kindergarten and make as much money as people who are working 70-hour weeks at some of the Chinese conglomerates. So it's fairly easy if you find the right position in China. Running away. People I spoke with said that they've met a number of people who seemed like they were running away from family issues, maybe warrants. They just seemed like real misfits that were trying to get away. And then least popular with a number of respondents was the person who was there finding a wife. Okay. I won't say any more about that. But so what? Let's just come up with a few conclusions. Adapting to another culture is hard. It dispels myths and perceptions. It ultimately decreases anxiety, toughens you up. It provides broader and deeper perspectives, especially about your home country, your host country. Increases empathy, absolutely increases empathy. And it teaches us when to be bold and when to be passive. Causes us to rethink and evaluate our worldview. And finally, it is so worth it. I think everybody that I spoke to would completely agree. There again are the chapters to my book, and thank you very much. Okay, so if anyone's still there, I'm happy to take questions.
Don, do you want to stop sharing your screen so that we can all see each other in gallery mode?
Sure.
Here we go. Thank you. Well, I thank you for that presentation, and I wanted to start off with a question of my own, and then I'm sure there will be other questions. It's really interesting to see the overview of the things that people gain from experiences abroad. I was wondering, though, if you could talk is there anything specific to being abroad in China? You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of the things that you described, you would get that from being abroad, kind of in, wherever you went. But is there anything specific about China that would give a particular twist on those types of, outcomes?
I think, for example, being compared to, say, being in Japan, where I spent quite a while, and everything is very kind of neat and clean and first world, and you don't really see a lot of the grit. In China, you're definitely going to see some more grit, as you would in a lot of countries that are lesser developed. But in China, you're going to see some of the developed and some of the lesser developed. You're going to see the rich and the poor commingling. And sometimes you'll see some things that might shock you. When you get to the countryside, like we've been able to take a lot of students from Wayne State to the countryside, you're going to see some things that'll open your eyes. You're going to see certain levels of poverty, which are not always bad. I mean, the bad side is that you really don't have a lot of medical care available. But most of my students came back saying, oh my gosh, they're so much happier than we are. Why are we there? What are we trying to do for them? These people come in and they're smiling and they're laughing and they're getting a kick out of, just about everything. So that whole idea of trying to be the, kind of missionary who's there to show them a better way of life, I think is a great myth that's dispelled oftentimes by going to places that you expect to be more morally impoverished than they are. Often people are richer in many ways than you might expect.
Well, thank you for that answer. Let's see if anyone else has a question.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Tracy.
Hi. I just want to know what has surprised you the most when interviewing the 20 impacts millennials during the interview?
What impacted people the most?
No, I mean, what a surprise. What a surprise the most. Yeah.
The surprise was, I think, that took me the longest time to figure out was the idea of boldness combined with passivity, right? So how can you become both bold and passive? Because I kept getting these answers and it felt like, which was it? And then I started to realize that, as a result of maturing, as a result of having to fend for yourself, you begin to really realize when to put your foot on the gas and when to take it off the gas, which is maybe something you don't have to do in your own country because you really know how to navigate, right? But when you get into difficult situations, there are times that you are required to do extraordinary things, right? But at the same time, you look at people around you and you realize, well, sometimes you catch more bees with, you catch more flies with honey, right, than with vinegar. So you need to be a little, bit more passive to figure out what you want. So that was, for me, a couple of days of thinking and, and reevaluating this with some of the people that I had interviewed. The other ones I can imagine, the empathy and, the worldview was interesting as well. And the fact that people went in different directions on the worldview, right? They sometimes became, their faith in whatever they believed in, maybe it was enhanced, and sometimes it was completely, dissembled. So.
Thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
John, I'm thinking about that tension between being bold and being passive, which you're right, that's really interesting. It makes me wonder if it's an outgrowth of having a metacognitive moment, that when you're in your own society, you automatically kind of know when to put your foot on the pedal and when to hold back. But when you're in a different society, it's kind of hard to know, what to do. And so they're learning to evaluate, okay, this is the situation where I've got to put my foot on the pedal. And that's the cultural situation where I take a back seat and see what happens. So to me, I mean, maybe that's kind of the, connective tissue there between the two, is that you're right. They're flip sides of the same phenomenon, which is figuring out how to operate in a foreign culture.
Yeah, and I think the metacognitive idea is interesting, and you're really broadening your view. You're thinking further outside your emotional box than you normally would, right? And you say, whoa, I have to make this adjustment. And in Japan, I learned to be passive almost all the time. And the hard part was coming back and trying to learn to actually assert myself and not play every accomplishment down entirely. So
Yeah, I'm sure. We've got another question here. Please go ahead.
yes.
Hi. So this is Huajing Maski. Hi, John. Congratulations. What a unique angle. I'm so glad you told me about this forum. And so to everybody else, I'm new to Wayne State. So, but my question, John, is have you been keeping in touch with all your correspondents, these people who send you comments during the pandemic? And what, if so, has the topic been, has anything touched upon the shutdown mentality, and in relation, of course, with what's going on just in the last weekend, right? What's happening in China? Any thoughts on those?
Let me see if I can unpack that all. First of all, the people that I interviewed, I am still in touch with the vast majority of them. Sometimes on Facebook, I was just IMing somebody from California today. And when he came to visit, I would get together with, 4 or 5 of the people who happened to have taken part in my study. My nephew still lives in Wuhan. He's been there the entire time. He's been there for 11 years. And so I get a few things from him. In terms of the last few days, I can't say a whole lot. These are things that are just beginning to unravel. And I'm even finding that even my international friends are a little bit more reluctant to take part in any conversation that is even slightly political, which, I don't know if that is a trend. I mean, certainly we felt that since Xi Jinping took over, but I feel like there's less willingness to engage even in an email. And even with my Chinese friends who were much more open with me, I'm finding a party line basically written to me, defending Putin's attack in Ukraine, for example, right? And I wouldn't have expected that if they were sitting here in my office. So yeah, there's definitely a trend. I mean, I can only say from my own personal perspective. I don't have any, metadata to confirm it, but yeah, that's what I've been noticing.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh,
Jamie, I have a quick question for Professor. First of all, I want to thank him for a very important talk. It's sometimes people give these very scholarly thoughts and immerse you in all kinds of theories. But this was a talk that made me understand in a fundamental way some of the issues involved. But I wondered, Dr. Brender, did you have any impressions about the differences or the perceived differences between places like Hong Kong and mainland China? I guess one of the things I spent just a week in Hong Kong, and that was my only Chinese experience. But and then I got hurt on the first day of my conference, so it's a frustration. But when I was going there, people said, well, look, one of the things you might want to investigate is in the sort of psychological differences between people from Hong Kong and mainland China. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think like you, I also spent a weekend in Hong Kong, but it was a pretty intense weekend.
Yeah.
And it was back in, I think, 2010, something like that. My impression was that Hong Kong was really where East meets West. I was so impressed with seeing how things just sort of came together. I mean, it was really a mixture of British and Chinese culture. I mean, on a superficial level, you would have breakfast and you would have, noodle soup and toast and one egg and coffee and tea, right? So there were like all these things combined. Something unique, I think, to China was that people queued up very strictly like they would in Britain, which is not something you find in China. In China, lines are just sort of, I think, theoretical suggestions. So there's definitely a very British mentality. You could speak English to anybody and they would understand. There was definitely a lot more highly developed infrastructure, but you could also feel the Eastern mindset. So, if you want to know what it's like to see East meets West, either go to the Philippines or go to Hong Kong. And you'll see that complete understanding of both sides. But once you get into China, it's a different ball game, and especially once you get into the Chinese countryside, which I believe is where you really meet, the real China, as opposed to something like Beijing, right? They say New York is not the United States, right? And likewise, Beijing is not necessarily China. But once you get into the inland and the countryside, and even Wuhan, a secondary city, supposedly with more people than the state of Michigan. But you really get to, I think, see the Chinese mind and mindset in places like that. But yeah, Hong Kong is really, it's a hybrid.
Just to follow up quickly on that point, one of the observations that I had made before going to Hong Kong was that what I was likely to find is a certain homogeneity in China and diversity in Hong Kong. And I was looking forward to sort of doing that, observing that, but I was frustrated because I got hurt. But what would you say that that's a good dichotomy about the homogeneity in mainland China and the kind of diversity in, say, places like Hong Kong?
I mean, Hong Kong, I think, is homogeneous in the sense that everybody's there to make money. It's like New York. Either you are spending money or you're making money every second, right? So you're really there and you're on the go. The rest of China is a lot less homogeneous than you might think. I mean, there are really a lot of different cultures and ideas converging into different places and that kind of a thing. So if I were to compare, for example, Japan to China, I would say that Japan is far more homogeneous. I mean, I can almost make mistake. I can almost go so far as to say they do this and they do that, right? And the Japanese will say, we Japanese do this, right? Whereas we're taught religiously never to say we Americans, right?
Yes.
And there are a lot of things I think that apply to the Japanese more uniformly, whereas I always say when you've met one Chinese, you've met one Chinese. You know, some of the most gracious people I've met, some of the least gracious people, some of the, you know, the most ambitious, the least ambitious. I mean, you take any superlative and you're probably going to find that person in China.
Thank you, sir.
I think we've got time for one more question.
No.
Well, I've got a question for you, John. And it's about the gender gap and then and you know, people going, just taking out the category of people who are going to look for wives. You know, is that comparable to, is there a similar gender gap just in general with people who study abroad, or is that specific to China, that more men go than women?
That's a great question. I honestly, I can't answer that. I don't have any data, and I can't even really think in terms of when I was in Japan. I mean, it felt like there were a lot of women, a lot of men, but I never really counted. Yeah, I mean, exactly what accounts for that, I can't say exactly. Might be that you need to be a little bit more adventurous to go to a place like China.
That's what I was wondering, if some of those first impressions, or those you know, mistaken impressions that China was dangerous or third world, might, you know, account for it as well as the wife seeking.
Yeah, I mean,
that's interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard about this, the gender difference, because regularly we know that study abroad is more female, right? And more white and more socially affluent population of students that participate in education abroad. And so what you just talked about, more male than female going to China and Japan?
I don't know about Japan. I can't speak at all for Japan. And like I said, I could not find any official data regarding, you know, male and female participants in China. But just asking people in general, you know, and I went through all my participants and say, you know, what's your guess on the ratio? It tended to be probably a lot more men than women.
Huh.
And
Interesting.
maybe it is wife seekers. I don't know. There are a lot of, you know, unseemly characters who tend to go there as well. So, but I should say none of my 20 were unseemly. I have to say.
Yeah, I mean,
But they did talk about that.
I got that sense from people who are evading warrants.
That could well be. I mean, you know, if you talk to some of them, they will say, well, you know, there's a group that's in China that's out there, and you wonder, you know, how they ever kept a job doing anything. And, you know, and it's just they could support themselves teaching English or whatever it is that they were doing in China.
It might be men looking for wives.
Yeah, there's always that.
Oh, well, unless there are any other questions, I think it's a good time to wrap up. And I want to thank Dr. Brender for this very thought-provoking talk. You know, I agree with the Director Emeritus, Dr. Edwards, that it really was a wonderful overview of the subject, and it really shed a lot of light into it. And so I appreciated the way that you put the talk together, and I'd like to thank you for that. We'll give Dr. Brender a round of applause, and then we'll wrap it up. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you at the next brown bag.
Bye-bye.